Hey, Terry Caliendo from Dedicated Managers here again, and in this video I'm going to talk about how how I made the application dynamic and loaded from configuration files. So in the last video I showed that the app here, all of these fields, the form fields, and the child entities that are attached to the parent entities, whatever they may be, are loaded from configuration files, and so those configuration files are right here. So this defines the data for the application and what we're trying to track. In this case, we're tracking a person and its children and other people in the house and incomes and stuff like that, so that we can get them support services. That's specific to this operation that I'm writing this for, but I've made it so that it's very easy to go and change these configuration files and use it for a whole nother business or whatever use. So how is that done? This is more the code side, and it all starts with the routing component. So the router now has to be very dynamic, and previously I had the router had a path for every single entity, and every single entity was hard-coded. If we go back to, say, if I go back somewhere here and I view all the files and I look at the source and I look at my router file, here's where I had to have a path with the entity ID, or the collection ID that I was used in the Firestore, and its variable. This colon here represents means it's a variable, and so for every child, I had to put that child, create a path for the child on top of the parent, and so it looks like this one's very early on. There was only a couple. I probably shouldn't have gone back that far. Let's take a look somewhere here. Let's see, router. Let's see if this one's got more. So this one, for every, family advocacy case plan underneath the primary kinship caregiver, I had to have a route for every single, all these are routes for every single possibility of entity. So, that's to get into this child, the route changes here. And so here you can see that I had to hard code. I had to tell it that these routes exist and how to get to each form, and it was very cumbersome. So I had to define each route, and what I've done is I've gotten rid of that. So here was this is the old file where you can see I'm defining every single route for every possibility of whatever thing, whatever entity is being loaded, child. So for every child I had to just keep adding on to this. But now, if we take a look here in the new router, so this is my up-to-date code, and this is the router configuration file. And so all that stuff is gone, and now I just say, hey, anything that starts with DB is going to be my database structure where I'm going to load form fields. So I can still have my regular pages, and I can make it a regular website. I could have a home page, I could have an About Us page. All that stuff would be different paths. But anything that's got to do with the database, we're gonna load it here. And I've forgotten to add, requires auth. I need to add that to this so that the database can't be accessed. But ultimately, any route that starts with DB /DB is going to get routed to my template loader. And so the template loader will then go ahead and start loading all the data and everything. So let's take a look at that. First, let's take a look at, anything that starts with DB passes this, whatever this string is, gets passed to that template. So whether it's the short version here, which is just the first entity, or the second entity, or even let's get really deep and go into child custody status. So this entire thing gets passed to that that template loader. So just take anything that comes after the DB and pass it into template loader. So template loader is in my source files. here. I already had it loaded, but it gets passed in as the DB path variable, right? That's what I defined it as, call it the DB path variable. The regular expression says just consume everything that comes after this /DB and call it the DB path variable. So that puts that in there. And then what I have to do is I have to parse that out and figure out what entity I'm on. So the first thing we do is, let's take a look. Let's see where that shows up, DB path. And it shows up in the entity pointers here. So what happens is I need to figure out, I need to break down each of these fields into the entity and its ID, and then the child entity and its ID, and the child that child's child and its ID. I need to find each one of those separate pieces. So I do that with a regular expression here, and what I do is I create this function that says, hey, find the entity by matching a word character followed by 20 characters in the range of A to Z, or 0 to 9. And these are the automatic, that's the range of automatic IDs that Firestore creates when you allow it to create the ID for an entity. So I'm restricting this to Firestore. So when this ID here is automatically generated whenever I create a new object, so we go back to the beginning, or if we add an income, shoot, I lost my connection again. I got to reboot here. Some days that works fine, and some days it just crashes all the time. Anyway, if I add an income, watch the URL up here. If I add an income, right, it adds we're now on the next entity down, and here's this ID for it. When I created that new entity, I told Firestore to give me an ID for it, and so that's what it did. It gave it that, and it's restricted in their code to 20 characters, and it's a unique ID globally. Nowhere, the chances of anywhere other in the universe of something having that same ID is very, very, very small. You're talking like something like 40 different characters to the power of 20, which is a very big number. So basically what this function does is it breaks down that those individual parts, and it puts it into an array. So this entities, I have this entities array that I'm going to push the matches 1 and matches 2, which ultimately are this piece and this piece. So it's going to it's just going to loop over this string and pull this piece and this piece together and put that in the array, and then this piece and this piece, put that in the array. So I call that my entity pointers, which tells me, what are my entities that I'm loading, and where are they pointing to, and what is the the most child one that we're trying to look at. So that's where the how the DB path gets broken down and used. The DB path gets put into this entity pointers, which will get used throughout this file. You can see it showing up all kinds of places where I'm going to use it for whatever's needed. So let's talk about what happens now. So template loader gets loaded. What's the first thing that happens? So that the actual DB path getting broken down is not the first thing that happens. The first thing that happens is what happens in the created function. So initially, I set the loading indicator to true. So I've talked about that in the past, but that's what shows the when I first load something here, well, that's resetting the application, but these are the loaders. If I go from the dashboard to a new one, that loader right there that showed up there for a second, that's what this is doing. It's saying, hey, show that loader, then console log out just for debugging purposes where we're at, and then go and initialize the entity. So what does that mean? Well, that's something in this file. Initialize entity is a call here. It's a method in this file. And also notice that anytime I have a watcher that also calls the initialize entity, and that comes from this root entity doc ID. And what it's doing is anytime entity pointer 0, which is the root entity, that is this right here is what's going to show up in the root entity of spot 0, regardless of where I'm at in this chain. That's always going to be the 0. So if this changes, I know I need to reinitialize everything. So that's what I'm watching there for that initialization. And so if we go back, now we're back to whether we are reloading the page, or whether we're loading it fresh from the created side, or we're watching the variable to see if the root entity changes. And that's because when we go from here to here, I'm calling the same template, and Vue will reuse templates. It won't call the created function from here to here because in my store, those are all calling the same component, template loader. So template loader is not getting destroyed. If we look at the console, remember I said that in my template loader, when I create the function, when template loader is officially created, I say, log this created function in template loader. So now if I'm doing this right and I clear this, if I go from here to here, notice it didn't log that created function, even though I changed, my route changed. If I go to this one, my route changed again, but that output didn't come because it didn't run that created function, because Vue reused this template because it was already loaded. It didn't destroy it and recreate it. So that's why I have to do that watcher. And again, that's what this watch here does. I'm watching a certain computed variable, which is my, that it's ultimately watching, this right here on this guy. So if that changes, because everything below it is loaded from the root entity, and that's something I've shown in a different video, I think. I'm kind of out of scope from what I'm talking about here, but maybe it'll show up here. So anyway, we initially load the form, or we change the route in a certain way that the root entity changes. We call this initialize entity. So what does initialize entity do? So initialize entity, you can see it checks the current entity on the store. So this is where I store the knowledge of the information of the database. So of the fields and the values in the fields. So that's going back to my Vuex debugger here, and this is my Vuex is your global storage. This is the current entity. So I've loaded this particular primary kinship caregiver B4RN. That should be B4RN, and ultimately everything that has to do with that, all the sub-entities get loaded at the time the parent gets loaded. So the kinship child, there's one kinship child, it's already loaded. That's the NA one, and so if I hover over here and I click, whoops, that's not kinship child, that's why it's wrong. Here's the kinship child, I hover over it, here's NA, so that's that NA. Everything that's a child to the main parent entity gets loaded, including the main entity itself. So that's, it's looking to see if that exists yet. If it doesn't exist yet, if that current entity object is empty, that means we're initially loading the form. So we need to go and dispatch ultimately and go and get that entity. So I said that backwards. If the entity exists, we'll do some stuff. If it doesn't exist, so if this is false, which means current entity does not exist, we actually run the else statement, which says go and get, we've got a new load here. We're initially loading the app. Go and get the entity with the doc ID that was figured out. And so doc ID, the collection ID and the doc ID that I'm going to get are pulled from that chain of what I did with the URL. So if I look for root entity doc ID, we'll see that ultimately it is a computed variable. There it is, root entity doc ID, and it's its entity pointer 0, and the root entity collection ID is entity pointer 0, the 0th on the entity pointer, but it's the collection ID. So those are the what gets pulled out of this this entity pointers function. So just to hammer that home, what I can actually do probably, I'm going rogue here, hopefully this will work out. Before returning entities, I'll console.log that entities variable. I'll save it, and then when we hot reload, this should be what we're talking about there. So you can see the 0th one is the primary kinship caregiver. It abstracted that out. It's the 0th in the array is the root. Whoops, I didn't mean to hit that. I guess that's going to jump no matter what I do. So it puts the the collection ID and the doc ID for that in the 0th, and then the first space contains the the next variable down and its ID. And then if I add a child status, now we should have let's see, somewhere here it loaded. So here's the 3 that it's now loading. We pulled the primary kinship caregiver, pulled the kinship child, and the child custody status. So this whatever's up here creates the this string here, this array that I can now figure out what are we trying to load. The highest numbered one is going to be the one we're trying to load, and the 0th one is going to be the root. Where was I on the store here? So if the current entity is empty, we haven't done anything yet, go and load it. If it does exist, I only need to do something if the root changes, because remember, the root is what causes me to load the entire relationships, all of the children to the parent. Everything gets loaded when the root gets changed. So I don't really care what happens here as far as loading the new entities. As long as the root doesn't change, this stuff should already be loaded. And if I add a new one, it'll get poked in there by the add function. It'll get put in. But I only need to reload everything if that changes. So that's what this statement's doing here. It's saying if the the root entity collection ID, if that changes, well, now we got to go and we're changing everything. We're getting a new root entity, which is going to change all the children entities because it's a whole different person. Go and delete all the entities and listeners, and clean up is basically what that's saying doing, and then just start over and go and get the entity. So that only happens when the the root entity changes. If that doesn't exist, then it's changed. Then we just need to start over. If it is the same, if we have the entity, we load this page, from a link click, and that's already existent. Well, then fine, we're already loaded. Just basically we're saying, since there's no else statement here, we're saying do nothing. There's just nothing to do. Nothing has changed. We're fine. And so that's what happens on this watch and stuff like that. So that is how we initially get the the initial entity. So that's I had a phone call come in. I had to take a break there, and I kind of lost where I'm at. But that's how the the initial entities get loaded. So that this reaches out to the Firestore and then gets the data for the structure. But now, how do the forms and everything get loaded? These dynamic forms that we create from these variables or from these configuration files. So that ultimately comes from once the view is loaded, it's going to load the layout template, and it's going to pass in this entity config variable. And so this entity config variable is actually a computed variable that's going to change ultimately based on the route change or the entity pointers change. So that entity config that we're passed in, it's going to cause a reload of the the information based on what I'm sending, and that'll change if the doc ID changes. Doc ID is pulled, if we see up here, from those entity pointers that I was talking about earlier. That's pulled from that DB path URL. All this stuff here that we were talking about that gets loaded into this here. Ultimately that's used to figure out the current doc ID, and that's based on the entity pointer of length -1, which is that's the last one in the array. So whenever that last one changes, so whenever this last thing changes, if we go back to here, now it changed to 2. That last one's gone. So now instead of there being 3, there's 2, and so the doc ID there changed. So that's going to update this configuration object, and that's what's going to be passed into the template. So based on the route is what entity we're going to load, and then here's where the configuration comes in. So this triple dot operator says take this information and spread it out as its components, its parameters, and spread them out equal to the layout that it's in. I didn't say that right. It just means take this object and put its properties at the same level of the other properties and kind of merge them together. It's a spread operator. You can look it up. And so basically it takes what is routed entity config, that's this, where I find I pull in that root entity file. So root entity is pulled in here in my import. So I'm going and I'm getting that root entity, which is this file that we talked about in the other video, which loads the entire configuration for all the structure of the database. So that gets pulled in there. And so we're talking about the routed entity config again. That gets pulled in there. So I pull that configuration and I call it the configuration entity. And now I loop over the pointers, which is again, my path. Again, that's this stuff, which is telling me, what am I trying to load? And ultimately, I'm trying to get this kinship child on this view. So I loop over and I grab those the sub entities until I get the one that I'm trying to get, where it matches the the collection ID of the pointer. So I'm not going to get too deep into that, but basically it's pulling from this root entity, it's pulling the configuration for whichever form we're trying to load. In this case, I'm trying to load the kinship child. If it was here, it would be the primary kinship caregiver. So it would figure that out. That's what that's doing, is figuring out, what's the configuration that I need to get. What were we talking about? We were talking about, where that came from. So that entity config, which is, passed into the template, right? Here's the template here that we're loading, and we're passing in this entity config. And this entity config variable I just showed changes based on, basically, ultimately on the route. When the route changes, this gets updated, and so it's going to, update the information in the template. So what is that template? Well, I've created this template to be its own component so that I can have different templates. So that's why I call this the template loader. The loader creates all, does all the information it needs to do to prepare the information for the template. And the template, right now I have, a 2-column template. And basically it says, put the form, here's the form on the left, or in the first half, and then here's the sub-entity list on the right side. Ultimately, that's what this says. It's kind of confusing. You have to understand VFlex, but basically, at the larger size, make it a width of 4 on a scale of 12, and put it on the left, and put the entity form on the left, and then same thing for this VFlex for the sub-entity list. So basically, this layout is saying entity form on the left, sub-entity on the right. So that's the entity form on the left and the sub-entities on the right. So very easily, I could create another template and somehow load that. I haven't done that. Somehow choose what template with the URL to load. That's a bit more programming to figure out, but I could have the where the sub entities are on the left, and then the form is on the right. So that just gives me the ability to move that stuff around and have different views for maybe different preferences for people in the future. And then what happens there? Well, again, I pass that entity config file, that entity config, down to both of these components. So that entity config that changes, in the form, I pass that information to the form. So where is that entity form? Well, that's loaded here. It's a component. That's the entity form, and it loads from this variable, from this file, entity form. So this is that form file, and it defines what text field, what to show in the form based on that configuration object. So ultimately, that configuration object, that entity config, comes in as a prop, and I loop over it. I take the entity config form fields, which is ultimately in the configuration file. It's that entity config is this object, and then here's the form field parameter for whatever has been loaded, either this root entity, or if I pulled one of the sub entities and passed that along. Ultimately, that's what I'm looping over here. Is I'm looping over the configuration file and saying, hey, if the field type is text, if v-index, if the field type is text, load the text field configuration, or the text field form fields component, and that stuff is defined here. My different components for the different field types are defined down here, but basically load that text field if it's a text field. If it's a date, load the date loader, the different types of fields. So whatever order they show up in these form fields, it's just loading each form field one at a time and saying, hey, is this a text field? Okay, go and get the text component. Load the next one on the loop. So this one's the text field, and keep going and keep going. Okay, this one, we got to this one on the 5th or 6th loop or whatever it is. This one's a date field. So we are now going to load it has a type, the field type is date. I didn't point to that real quick, but here's field type is date. So that's here, the field type is equal to date. Okay, we'll load the date field component and send the information that it needs, which would be the rules, the label, and the field name. So that's this stuff, the field name, the label, and the rules. Really, there's no rules for a date, but on the text field there's rules. This was just copy and paste that probably shouldn't be there. Ultimately, if right now a user can't manually enter a date, so you can't. You have to use the date loader to change the date right now. On this, I think that's something. There's an issue there. Something's going on where that's not loading. I got to figure that out. It might be that I've lost the database connection again. Yep, there's that maximum call stack. Man, that's really getting prevalent. So it couldn't update the database, so it couldn't update. So here, now it's changing 8.2, 8.4. So you can't manually type this. I can't give you. You can't manually type in the date. You have to change it with the date picker right now. So that's why the rules don't make sense right now. Ultimately, I'm going to figure out how to make it so that you can do that. It was just very cumbersome with the way Vuetify implements that date picker. So anyway, that's looping over that configuration file and figuring out what form fields to load. So you can see everything's dynamic. There's no hard-coded. Before, these form fields were hard-coded by each form had its own, these field types, the field name and field label were all hard-coded, but now everything's in this configuration file, and it just gets looped over in the when the entity form is being displayed. I know this is probably very abstract, but the idea is to see that everything is now there's no hard-coded field names, or that would be the database field names or the labels, or everything's just pulled from this form field part of the entity config, and that entity config ultimately comes from this root entity configuration. So that's how that's the the template loader loads the template. I lost my template, but here's the 2-column template. And so, the same thing that happens on the entity form, same thing, I add I loop over the sub-entities of the entity config. So whatever level we're at, then we just go look at its sub-entities and we loop over those, and then that's how I pass each one of those to the sub-entity list. And so a sub-entity list ultimately loops over this part right here and displays the information that it needs about each one of those, and that's this part loading right here. And again, that's all dynamic from the configuration file. So that's probably about as deep as I'm going to go on that. Again, that was a 30-minute one, so that was pretty in depth. So only necessary for people that want to understand the programming or might want to get involved with the project. Anyway, hopefully that was understandable, helpful some way. Helped you figure something out. Again, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers. Feel free to leave a comment. Positive comments are always highly appreciated. Just motivates me to keep doing more. And constructive criticism will be taken happily as well, though. And feel free, if you want to, if you've watched this whole video and you want to collaborate, feel free to contact me at dedicatedmanagers.com is the website. I'll pull that up real quick. www.dedicatedmanagers.com. Just click to contact me at the contact link. So that's it. Have a great day. Happy coding. I am got to get back to doing some other work for clients rather than this internal stuff right now. So take care. Have a great day. Happy coding.